They called them death traps. Obsolete relics. Flying coffins that had no business being anywhere near a modern battlefield. When the first Canadian squadrons arrived in Britain with their aging aircraft, the laughter echoed through officers' mess halls from London to the coast. British commanders, accustomed to the latest Spitfires and the promise of cutting-edge technology, took one look at Canada's contribution to the war effort and shook their heads in disbelief. These weren't just old planes. They were embarrassments, or so the thinking went. Patched-up machines held together with determination and hope, flown by pilots from a country that barely had an air force worth mentioning just years earlier. But here's what those commanders didn't understand. They didn't see what was coming. They couldn't have known that these same planes they mocked, these same pilots they dismissed, would soon write one of the most extraordinary chapters in aerial combat history. They couldn't have predicted that when everything hung in the balance, when the future of freedom itself teetered on a knife's edge, it would be these rusty Canadian machines that made the difference between victory and catastrophe. This is the story of how the underestimated became unstoppable. How mockery turned to respect. How Canada's supposedly outdated Air Force proved that courage, skill, and determination matter more than the newest technology or the shiniest equipment. It's a story that history almost forgot, overshadowed by larger narratives and bigger names. But the truth is powerful, and the truth is this. When Britain needed miracles, Canada delivered them in planes held together with rivets, hope, and an unbreakable spirit. September 1939. The world had just plunged into its second Great War in a generation, and Canada found itself once again answering Britain's call. But this time was different. This wasn't the trench warfare of the previous conflict. This was a new kind of war, one that would be won or lost in the skies above Europe. And Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force was woefully unprepared for what lay ahead. The numbers tell a stark story. When war broke out, the RCAF had fewer than 5,000 personnel and a fleet of aircraft that military historians would later describe as barely adequate for peacetime training, let alone modern combat. Many of their planes were biplanes, designs that belonged to the previous decade. Their equipment was a hodgepodge of whatever Canada could afford or manufacture, often second-hand purchases or hand-me-downs from other nations. The budget had been minimal, the priority low, and the result was an air force that looked more like a flying club than a military force ready for global conflict. But Canada had something that couldn't be measured in equipment inventories or budget allocations. It had young men who were willing to fly anything anywhere to do their part. Farmer sons from Saskatchewan who had grown up fixing tractors and understood machinery in their bones. Bush pilots from the Northern Territories who had learned to coax failing engines through impossible weather. Mechanics from Montreal and Toronto who could rebuild an engine with limited tools and unlimited ingenuity. These weren't pampered aristocrats learning to fly as a gentleman's hobby. These were tough, resourceful, determined individuals who saw flying as both a challenge and an opportunity to prove themselves on the world stage. The British Royal Air Force needed pilots desperately. The expansion of the RAF had created a voracious appetite for trained airmen, and Canada's contribution would be vital through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. But even as Canadian pilots proved their worth, the aircraft they brought with them remained objects of derision. When the first RCAF squadrons deployed to Britain with their Hawker Hurricanes, planes that were already being phased out in favor of newer models, the reaction from some quarters was less than enthusiastic. One British squadron leader was overheard describing the Canadian aircraft as looking like they had been assembled from spare parts scavenged from a dozen different junkyards. The comment wasn't entirely inaccurate. Many of Canada's Hurricanes were indeed older models, some with fabric-covered wings while newer versions featured all-metal construction. They had been patched and repaired countless times during training. Their paint jobs were uneven, their engines showed the wear of hard use, and compared to the gleaming Spitfires stationed at nearby airfields, they looked decidedly second-rate. The mockery cut deep. Canadian pilots and ground crews heard the comments, saw the sideways glances, felt the dismissive attitudes. These young men had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, had volunteered knowing they might never return home, and they were being treated like poor relations showing up to a family gathering in shabby clothes. The resentment could have been corrosive. It could have destroyed morale and unit cohesion. Instead, it became fuel. A chip on the shoulder that would drive them to prove every doubter wrong. The ground crews worked double shifts, maintaining their aircraft to standards that would have made factory engineers proud. They scavenged parts, improvised solutions, and treated each plane like it was their personal responsibility to keep it flying. The pilots trained relentlessly, pushing themselves and their machines to the limit. They studied combat tactics, learned from experienced RAF pilots who took them seriously, and developed skills that would soon be tested in the most intense aerial combat the world had ever seen. Then came the spring of 1940, and everything changed. Hitler's forces swept through Western Europe with shocking speed. Denmark fell. Norway was invaded. The Wehrmacht crashed through the Low Countries and into France with an efficiency that stunned military observers worldwide. The French army, considered one of the strongest in Europe, crumbled under the German blitzkrieg. And suddenly Britain stood alone, separated from Nazi occupation by only a narrow strip of water called the English Channel. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and everyone knew what was at stake. If Germany could achieve air superiority over the Channel and southern England, invasion would follow. If Britain fell, Nazi Germany would control all of Western Europe. The free world's last major stronghold against fascism would be gone. Everything depended on the Royal Air Force's ability to defend British airspace against the Luftwaffe, which outnumbered them and was flush with confidence from its victories across the continent. Canadian squadrons were integrated into Fighter Command's defensive strategy. Despite the earlier mockery, there was no question of keeping them out of the fight. Britain needed every aircraft and every pilot it could muster. The Canadians would fly their aging Hurricanes into combat, and if they and their planes weren't good enough, well, they would find out soon enough when German fighters and bombers filled the skies. The first major engagements came in July 1940. German aircraft began probing Britain's defenses, testing response times and capabilities. Canadian pilots flew their first combat missions, and the reality of war came crashing home. This wasn't training exercises or peacetime patrols. This was life and death at 300 miles per hour, with tracers cutting through the air and aircraft falling from the sky in flames. And something remarkable began to happen. Those rusty Canadian Hurricanes, those supposedly obsolete machines that British commanders had laughed at, started racking up kills. German bombers fell to their guns. Messerschmitt fighters learned that these Canadian pilots were not easy prey. The supposedly outdated tactics and aging equipment were proving devastatingly effective in actual combat. The Hurricane, despite being overshadowed by the sexier Spitfire in popular imagination, was actually an incredibly effective weapons platform. It was rugged, able to absorb battle damage that would down other aircraft. It was stable, making it an excellent gun platform for less experienced pilots. And it was numerous, making up the majority of Fighter Command strength during the critical early months of the Battle of Britain. While Spitfires often engaged German fighters, Hurricanes went after the bombers, the real threat to British cities and infrastructure. Canadian pilots excelled in this role. Their improvised training, their experience with difficult conditions, their mechanical understanding of their aircraft, all of it came together. They could nurse damaged engines home. They could extract maximum performance from worn equipment. They could improvise repairs and modifications that kept them flying when others would have been grounded. The very characteristics that had made their planes look shabby, the patches and repairs and makeshift solutions, became advantages. These planes and pilots knew how to make do, how to overcome, how to win despite disadvantages. August 1940 brought the battle to its peak intensity. The Luftwaffe launched massive raids, sending hundreds of aircraft at a time against British targets. The sky above southern England became a chaotic maelstrom of dogfights, with aircraft wheeling and diving, guns chattering, and brave men dying on both sides. The RAF was stretched to its breaking point. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, landing only to refuel and rearm before going back up. Ground crews worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. The entire British defensive system operated at maximum capacity with no margin for error. And in the middle of this crucible, Canadian squadrons distinguished themselves again and again. No. 242 Squadron, though led by British legend Douglas Bader, was composed largely of Canadian pilots and proved itself one of the most effective units in Fighter Command. No. 1 Squadron RCF, the first Article 15 squadron formed under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, entered combat and quickly established a reputation for aggressiveness and effectiveness. The individual stories are staggering. Canadian pilots like Willie McKnight, who would become one of the top-scoring Hurricane aces of the battle. Stan Turner, who would later command squadrons and wings. Dow Russell, who shot down multiple German aircraft despite flying planes that others had written off as barely airworthy. These men didn't have the newest equipment or the most resources, but they had something else. They had the determination to prove themselves. They had the skill developed through hard training and harder combat. And they had each other, a brotherhood forged in fire. One engagement in particular became legendary. A Canadian squadron, flying their much-maligned Hurricanes, intercepted a large formation of German bombers escorted by fighters. The odds were terrible. They were outnumbered, their aircraft were supposedly inferior, and they were facing experienced Luftwaffe crews who had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Every tactical consideration suggested caution, disengagement, waiting for reinforcements. The Canadians attacked anyway. They dove into the enemy formation with guns blazing, breaking apart the bomber stream and engaging the escorts simultaneously. The fight that followed was savage and chaotic, a swirling melee that tested every ounce of pilot skill and aircraft performance. And when the smoke cleared, when the surviving aircraft limped back to their bases, the Germans had lost multiple bombers and fighters while the Canadian squadron had suffered minimal losses. But more importantly, the bomber formation had been turned back. The targets they were heading for, factories and airfields critical to Britain's war effort, remained untouched. The raid that German planners had expected to succeed had failed, stopped by pilots flying planes that British commanders had once dismissed as inadequate. Word of the engagement spread quickly. Suddenly, those rusty Canadian planes didn't look so rusty anymore. Suddenly, the pilots flying them weren't poor relations but respected warriors who had proven themselves in the hardest school imaginable. The laughter stopped. The mockery ended. In its place came respect, earned through blood and courage in the skies above Britain. The contributions went beyond individual engagements. Canadian pilots and aircraft represented a crucial percentage of fighter command's available strength during the battle's most critical phase. When the RAF was bleeding pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate, when every Hurricane and Spitfire mattered desperately, the Canadian squadrons provided essential capability that might have been the difference between holding the line and collapse. Historians still debate exactly how close Britain came to losing the Battle of Britain. What's not debatable is that every aircraft and pilot mattered, and the Canadians provided both in numbers and quality that exceeded all expectations. The ground crews deserve their own recognition. British observers were astonished at the serviceability rates Canadian units achieved with their supposedly substandard equipment. While other squadrons struggled to keep aircraft flying, Canadian ground crews somehow kept their Hurricanes in the air through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer bloody-mindedness. They worked through bombing raids, slept under wings when they slept at all, and treated every aircraft like it was the difference between victory and defeat. Because it was. Every plane that couldn't fly was one less defender in the sky. Every aircraft grounded for maintenance was a gap in Britain's defensive wall. The Canadian ground crews understood this viscerally, and they refused to let their pilots down. They performed miracles of improvisation, finding ways to keep engines running that should have been sent back for depot-level overhaul. They patched battle damage and had aircraft back in service while other units were still writing up the damage reports. They proved that the human element, the dedication and expertise of the people maintaining the machines, mattered just as much as the design specifications and manufacturing quality. September 1940 marked the turning point. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. British fighters, including those rusty Canadian Hurricanes, had exacted such a heavy toll that German losses became unsustainable. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely, then permanently. Britain had survived, would continue to fight, would become the base from which Allied forces would eventually liberate Europe. The Battle of Britain was won, and Canadian pilots and aircraft had played a crucial role in that victory. The recognition came slowly but surely. British commanders who had once dismissed Canadian contributions now publicly praised them. Winston Churchill's famous speech about "never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few" included those Canadian pilots and their supposedly inadequate aircraft. The official histories acknowledged Canadian contributions. The scores and accomplishments spoke for themselves. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the pilots and crews who had fought alongside the Canadians. The mutual respect developed in combat, the bonds formed between men who had faced death together, transcended national boundaries and equipment prejudices. British pilots who had once joked about Canadian rust buckets now flew alongside them with complete trust. Ground crews shared techniques and solutions. The Commonwealth Air Forces became a genuinely integrated fighting force, stronger together than the sum of their parts. The legacy extended far beyond the Battle of Britain. Canadian pilots and aircraft would go on to serve with distinction in every theater of the Second World War. In North Africa, Canadian squadrons flew ground attack missions against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Over Malta, they helped defend the beleaguered island against sustained Axis attack. In the Burma campaign, they supported ground forces in some of the war's most difficult conditions. And in the strategic bombing offensive against Germany, Canadian air crews flew heavy bombers deep into enemy territory night after night. The RCAF that ended the war bore no resemblance to the tiny force that had existed in 1939. It had become one of the world's largest air forces, with hundreds of thousands of personnel and modern equipment. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, largely based in Canada, had trained over 130,000 aircrew from across the Commonwealth and Allied nations. Canada had become a major military aviation power, and its contribution to victory was undeniable. But it all traced back to those early days, to those young pilots climbing into aging Hurricanes while British officers laughed at their rust buckets. It traced back to ground crews maintaining equipment that should have been retired, to commanders who refused to accept that inadequate equipment meant inadequate performance, to a nation that punched far above its weight because its people refused to be dismissed or underestimated. The lessons resonate beyond the specific historical moment. They speak to the power of determination in the face of mockery, of proving doubters wrong through performance rather than words. They demonstrate that the newest equipment and biggest budgets don't guarantee victory if the human element is lacking. They show that adversity can forge strength, that being underestimated can become an advantage when it fuels determination rather than defeatism. Think about those young Canadian pilots for a moment. Many of them had never left their home provinces before joining the RCF. They came from small towns and farms, from fishing villages and mining camps. They were ordinary young men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, given aging equipment and told to defend freedom against one of history's most formidable military machines. They could have failed. They should have failed by all reasonable expectations. Instead, they exceeded every benchmark, surpassed every standard, and helped win one of history's most crucial battles. The aircraft themselves deserve consideration too. The Hawker Hurricane, often overshadowed by the Spitfire, was the real workhorse of the Battle of Britain. It shot down more enemy aircraft than all other British defenses combined. It was tough, reliable, and effective. Yes, the Canadian Hurricanes were older models, worn from hard use, maintained under difficult conditions. But they were still Hurricanes, and in the hands of skilled pilots supported by dedicated ground crews, they were deadly. There's a deeper truth here about technology and warfare. The cutting-edge equipment matters less than we often think. What matters is training, maintenance, tactics, morale, determination, and the will to win. The Germans had newer aircraft in many cases, better overall equipment, more resources. They lost the Battle of Britain anyway. The British and Commonwealth forces, flying a mix of modern and aging aircraft, held the line because of superior tactics, better intelligence, and the advantage of fighting over home territory where every pilot saved could fly again. The Canadian contribution embodied this truth. They didn't win because their planes were secretly superior. They won because they were better prepared, better motivated, and better supported than the enemy expected. They won because they turned their disadvantages into strengths, because they refused to accept that old equipment meant inevitable defeat, because they believed in themselves and each other even when others didn't believe in them. The transformation in perception is striking. In just a few months, Canadian pilots and aircraft went from being objects of derision to respected combat veterans with proven records. The same British officers who had laughed at rusty Canadian planes were requesting Canadian squadrons for critical missions. The same equipment that had been dismissed as inadequate was sought after for its reliability and effectiveness. Nothing about the physical aircraft had changed. What changed was the understanding of what really mattered in combat. This shift in perception reflects a broader pattern in military history. Time and again, forces that appear inferior on paper achieve victories that shock observers. The Winter War saw Finland hold off the Soviet Union with vastly inferior numbers and equipment. The Battle of Midway saw American carrier pilots turn the tide of the Pacific War despite being outnumbered and outgunned in many respects. The Israeli Air Force achieved air superiority in the Six-Day War despite facing larger enemy forces. In each case, factors beyond raw equipment specifications determined the outcome. The Canadian experience in the Battle of Britain fits this pattern perfectly. They succeeded because they maximized the potential of what they had rather than lamenting what they lacked. They succeeded because their people were superbly trained and motivated. They succeeded because they adapted tactics to their equipment's strengths and minimized its weaknesses. They succeeded because they refused to accept that being underestimated meant being defeated. There's an emotional power to this story that transcends the tactical and strategic details. It's a story about underdogs proving themselves, about courage in the face of mockery, about vindicating faith in yourself when others doubt. These are universal themes that resonate across cultures and eras. We all face moments when we're dismissed, when our tools seem inadequate, when the odds appear insurmountable. The Canadian pilots and their rusty planes remind us that what matters is how we respond to those moments. Consider the pressure they faced. They were representing their nation in the most important military contest of their generation. They were flying equipment that had been publicly mocked. They knew that failure would confirm every doubt and dismissal. The weight of expectation, the burden of proving an entire country's worth, could have been crushing. Instead, they channeled it into motivation. Every successful mission was a rebuke to the doubters. Every German aircraft shot down was proof that Canada belonged on the world stage. The ground crews felt similar pressure. Every mechanical failure could have been attributed to inadequate equipment or poor maintenance. Every aircraft that didn't return could have been blamed on substandard machines. They refused to give anyone that excuse. They maintained their aircraft to standards that exceeded peacetime norms, working under wartime conditions that would have broken lesser teams. Their pride in their work, their commitment to their pilots, drove them to perform at levels that astonished observers. This is where the story transcends its specific historical context and becomes something larger. It becomes a testament to human potential, to what people can achieve when they commit fully to a cause they believe in. The Canadians weren't fighting for glory or conquest. They were fighting for survival, for freedom, for the right of free peoples to determine their own future. That clarity of purpose, that moral certainty, gave them strength that no amount of equipment could provide. The battles themselves were terrifying beyond imagination. Modern audiences, accustomed to seeing aerial combat in sanitized movies and video games, struggle to comprehend the reality. These were young men strapping themselves into cramped cockpits, climbing to altitudes where the air was thin and cold, then diving into formations of enemy aircraft that were trying to kill them. Every mission could be their last. Every engagement could end with their aircraft spiraling into the ground or the sea, with them burning alive in a fireball or bleeding out from wounds in a cockpit they couldn't escape. They did this day after day, mission after mission, until either the war ended or they died. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots watched friends die, saw aircraft explode, lived with the constant awareness of their own mortality. The stress manifested in nightmares, in shaking hands, in thousand-yard stares. And yet they kept flying, kept fighting because they understood what was at stake and refused to quit. The Canadian pilots showed particular resilience. Perhaps it was their background, many coming from tough rural or frontier communities where hardship was normal and quitting wasn't an option. Perhaps it was national character, a quiet determination that didn't require flash or braggadocio. Perhaps it was simply the human capacity for adaptation, for finding strength we didn't know we possessed when circumstances demand it. Whatever the source, they endured and persevered through a crucible that broke many strong men. The tactical evolution during the battle showcased their adaptability. Early engagements revealed flaws in RAF tactics, formations that were too rigid and ineffective against aggressive German fighters. The Canadians, along with other experienced units, adapted quickly. They developed new tactics, tighter formations, better communication procedures. They learned from every mission, every engagement, every close call. The improvement was rapid and decisive, turning early struggles into later dominance. This adaptability extended to equipment management. Pilots learned exactly what their Hurricanes could and couldn't do. They knew their aircraft's best altitude, optimal speed, tightest turn radius, most effective attack profiles. They understood how to use their plane's strengths against enemy weaknesses. A Hurricane couldn't outturn a Messerschmitt 109 at high altitude, but it could outdive one and was more stable in a vertical fight. Knowing these details, exploiting them ruthlessly, made the difference between victory and death. The partnership between pilots and ground crews was crucial. Pilots would debrief after missions, reporting any mechanical issues or performance quirks. Ground crews would address them immediately, often developing improvised solutions that became standard practice. This feedback loop, this constant improvement and adaptation, turned good aircraft and crews into excellent ones. It was the kind of organizational learning that can't be rushed or forced, that only emerges from shared purpose and mutual trust. As the battle progressed and Canadian successes mounted, the initial mockery seems almost incomprehensible in retrospect. How could experienced British officers have been so wrong in their initial assessments? The answer reveals something important about human psychology and institutional culture. Preconceptions are powerful. The British military establishment had certain ideas about equipment standards, about what constituted an effective fighting force. The Canadian aircraft didn't fit those preconceptions, so they were dismissed without serious consideration of other factors. This kind of institutional blindness affects all large organizations. Established ways of thinking become entrenched, and evidence that contradicts them is minimized or ignored. It takes dramatic proof to overcome such biases, and the Canadians provided that proof in the most definitive way possible, through success in combat. Once the results were undeniable, perceptions shifted rapidly. But that initial bias, that reflexive dismissal, could have had serious consequences if the Canadians hadn't been able to prove themselves. The vindication must have been sweet for those who had endured the mockery. Imagine being a Canadian pilot who had listened to British officers laugh at your plane, then shooting down multiple enemy aircraft in that same plane. Imagine being a ground crew chief who had heard your maintenance work dismissed, then achieving serviceability rates that exceeded peacetime standards. The satisfaction of proving doubters wrong, of exceeding low expectations, must have been profound. But there's also a poignant element to this story. Many of those who proved themselves so effectively didn't survive to see the war's end. The Battle of Britain was just the beginning of a long, brutal conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of Commonwealth lives. Canadian pilots who survived the summer of 1940 would go on to fight in other battles, other campaigns, and many would eventually fall. Their triumph over mockery and doubt was real, but it came at a terrible price. The memorialization of their contribution has been uneven. In Canada, their story is reasonably well known, taught in schools and commemorated in monuments. But internationally, the Canadian contribution to the Battle of Britain often gets overshadowed by British narratives that focus on RAF squadrons and the Spitfire. This is unfortunate, because the full story is richer and more inspiring when all contributors are recognized. The lesson for future generations is clear and powerful. Never underestimate people because their equipment looks outdated or their resources seem limited. Never judge capability by appearances alone. The human element, the skill and determination and courage of the people involved, matters more than the hardware they're using. The Canadians proved this beyond any doubt during the Battle of Britain, and their example should inform how we think about challenges and resources in our own lives. When you're facing a difficult task with limited tools, remember those Canadian pilots and their rusty Hurricanes. Remember that they were mocked and dismissed, then proved every doubter wrong through skill and determination. Remember that the newest equipment means nothing without the expertise to use it and the will to push through adversity. Remember that being underestimated can be an advantage if you let it motivate rather than discourage you. The story also speaks to the importance of recognizing and respecting contributions from unexpected sources. The British military establishment almost missed the value of the Canadian contribution because of superficial judgments about equipment quality. How many other valuable contributions get overlooked because they don't fit our preconceptions? How many talented people or innovative ideas are dismissed because they don't look the way we expect excellence to look? The Canadians remind us to look deeper, to judge by results rather than appearances, to remain open to being surprised by capability from unexpected quarters. For Canada as a nation, the Battle of Britain represented a coming of age. The country had fought in the First World War, but often in the shadow of British leadership. The Second World War saw Canada emerge as a significant military power in its own right, making independent contributions that earned respect on the world stage. Those rusty Hurricanes and the young pilots who flew them were part of that transformation, proving that Canada could stand alongside any nation when it mattered most. The evolution of the RCAF from a tiny peacetime force to one of the world's major air forces is a remarkable organizational achievement. It required massive expansion of training capacity, development of maintenance and logistics systems, recruitment and retention of personnel, and adaptation to rapidly changing technology and tactics. The fact that Canada accomplished this while simultaneously contributing significantly to combat operations speaks to national capacity and organizational excellence that surprised many observers. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan deserves special mention. Based largely in Canada, it trained aircrew from across the Commonwealth in a safe environment far from enemy attack. Canadian geography, with its vast open spaces and varied terrain, proved ideal for flight training. The infrastructure built to support the program represented a massive investment that paid enormous dividends. By war's end, Canadian training facilities had produced a significant percentage of Commonwealth aircrew, a contribution to victory that matched or exceeded direct combat participation. But it all started with those young pilots in their rusty planes, being laughed at by British commanders who couldn't see past surface appearances to the substance beneath. It started with ground crews who refused to let inadequate equipment be an excuse for inadequate performance. It started with a nation that punched far above its weight because its people had the courage and determination to prove themselves on the world's largest stage. The last Canadian veteran of the Battle of Britain has now passed away, taking with them direct memories of those desperate days in 1940. But the story lives on, preserved in histories and memorials, in the restored aircraft that fly at air shows, in the lessons taught to new generations of military aviators. The story lives on because it matters, because it tells us something important about human potential and national character, because it reminds us that David really can defeat Goliath when courage and skill make up for material disadvantages. Those rusty Canadian Hurricanes weren't the newest or shiniest aircraft in the sky over Britain in 1940. But they were flown by pilots who refused to accept that old equipment meant inevitable defeat, maintained by crews who performed miracles to keep them flying, and supported by a nation that believed in its people even when others doubted. Together, they helped win one of history's most crucial battles, turned mockery into respect, and wrote a chapter of Canadian history that still inspires today. That's the power of determination. That's the value of courage. That's what happens when the underestimated refuse to accept other people's limitations and instead prove what they're truly capable of achieving.